My family treated me like a warning sign, not a daughter. The engagement dinner for my brother Jacob was in full swing when my mother, Susan, tapped her crystal glass. To Jacob, she announced, and to Tessa, our little trash hauler, reminding us why higher education matters. Laughter rippled through the guests. But Dr. Alana Sorrento, Jacob's future mother-in-law, froze, staring at me because she knew exactly who I was. Before I show you my mother's face when the truth came out, drop a comment. Have you ever stopped shrinking yourself for others? I'm reading your stories. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I simply reached into my purse, pulled out my phone, and slid it across the white linen tablecloth directly to Dr. Sorrento. The screen displayed my company's live operational dashboard. It wasn't a schedule for trash collection. It was the structural restoration blueprint for the city's largest disaster recovery project, a high-profile infrastructure overhaul that I was directing as the chief engineer. It was a massive, complex project that completely dwarfed Jacob's small-time finance bonus. I manage disaster recovery, I said, my voice cold and methodical, slicing through the remaining chuckles at the table. I clean up catastrophic structural messes. And looking around this table, it seems I brought my work home with me. My father, Richard, leaned over to look at the screen, his brow furrowing as the massive budget figures and operational metrics stared back at him. For 32 years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family. While Jacob spent his teenage years playing golf on our parents' dime, I was taking night classes in structural restoration. While they celebrated his mediocre college achievements, I was analyzing load-bearing capacities and project management logistics. I was building a career out of steel and concrete while they built an illusion. People often ask why I stayed so long, why I endured the constant belittling, the casual cruelty, the relentless feeling of being an outsider in my own home. It is the invisible chain of the survivor. When you are raised in a system that constantly diminishes your worth, you don't fight back right away. You learn to survive. You internalize the belief that if you just work a little harder, if you just become a little more useful, they will eventually see your value. It is a psychological prison without bars. You stay because you are conditioned to believe that their approval is the ultimate currency, and you keep paying into an emotionally bankrupt account, hoping for a return on investment that will never come. But sitting at that table, watching my parents sneer at me while praising Jacob's minor accomplishments, the illusion shattered. I realized their affection had been a subscription model, and I was no longer willing to foot the bill. I saw with absolute clarity that they did not love me. They only loved the image of a broken daughter who made their golden sun look brighter by comparison. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret for what I was about to do, but there was only razor-sharp clarity. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet, and they were hopelessly in the red. The engagement dinner carried on, but the power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. I retrieved my phone, leaving a stunned silence in my wake. I did not storm out or raise my voice. I simply sat there, observing the strangers who shared my DNA, calculating the exact cost of their arrogance. The retaliation began before the dessert plates were cleared. My father pulled me aside into the hallway, his face flushed with suppressed fury. "You are embarrassing the family, Tessa," he hissed, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "Making things up. Showing off fake spreadsheets to impress Alana. You are completely unhinged." My mother stood right behind him, nodding in aggressive agreement. She immediately pulled out her phone, composing a passive-aggressive social media post about dealing with troubled and jealous family members to control the narrative before the dinner was even over. They were attempting to gaslight me in real time, trying to rewrite history to cast themselves as the victims of my supposed instability. They expected me to argue. They expected tears, a frantic defense, a desperate plea for them to understand my side. But this was no longer a family drama. It was a business transaction. They weren't shocked by what they'd done to me. They were shocked that I had stopped playing along. I looked at them with total detachment. I didn't cry. I didn't defend my career. I walked away without uttering a single word. By 11:51 that night, I was back in my apartment, sitting at my desk with my laptop open. I didn't hesitate. I logged into the joint banking portals. For years, I had quietly managed their emergency funds, optimizing their investments, handling their tax liabilities, and keeping their financial heads above water using my own expertise. It was a thankless job they took completely for granted. At 11:52, I severed their access. I systematically began removing myself as the guarantor on their auxiliary accounts. I cancelled the automatic monthly transfers that had been quietly subsidizing their lavish country club lifestyle. I unlinked my stellar credit profile from their mounting debt. It was a clinical execution of financial separation. Anger wasn't loud. It was the quiet, methodical click of a mouse. By 12:03, the retaliation was complete. I watched the balances disconnect and the authorization privileges vanish from the screen. They had always cared more about their public image than their private reality. They loved to project an aura of wealth and sophistication, an image built on a foundation of sand that I had been quietly reinforcing with my own labor and capital. Now, that foundation was completely gone. I poured myself a glass of water, feeling perfectly calm. I was no longer the garbage hauler cleaning up their messes. I was the architect of their new reality. The sudden severing of funds would hit their accounts by Monday morning, bouncing checks and declining credit cards across the city. They had built their entire identity on an illusion of superiority and entitlement. I was simply returning them to their actual financial baseline, ending my silent investment in their facade. Monday morning arrived, and my phone began vibrating with frantic, back-to-back calls from Richard and Susan as their credit cards began declining. I ignored every single one of them. Instead, I drove straight to the downtown offices of my attorney, a ruthless corporate litigator named Marcus. This wasn't about petty revenge, it was about strict accounting. I sat across from him and laid out the financial documents I had secured before cutting my parents off. I need a formal notice drafted, I told Marcus, my voice devoid of any emotional waver, regarding the misappropriation of a trust fund. When I was 5 years old, my late grandmother had left me exactly $2,800. It was a small sum placed in a high-yield account meant to gather interest and help with my early education or living expenses. I had discovered years ago, while organizing their taxes, that the account had been emptied when I was a teenager. The funds had been funneled directly into Jacob's private school tuition. At the time, I had convinced myself that families share burdens, that my sacrifice was simply part of being a good daughter. Now, stripped of all sentimentality, I saw it for exactly what it was: theft. Marcus reviewed the documents, his eyes narrowing as he traced the undeniable paper trail. We drafted a meticulously worded legal notice demanding the immediate repayment of the $2,800 plus 20 years of compound interest at the maximum legal rate. It wasn't about the money. I made more than that in a single week managing disaster recovery sites. It was about establishing a firm legal precedent. It was about forcing them to realize that the daughter they treated like a trash hauler was actually a savvy professional tracking their theft with clinical, unyielding precision. The formal notice was served to their house via courier on Tuesday afternoon. The text messages from my mother instantly shifted from annoyed, entitled demands to panicked bargaining. "Tessa, how could you do this?" It was only $2,800. "We are your parents. We raised you. You are destroying this family over nothing." I read the message and deleted it. I felt no guilt. I had been the silent investor in their version of family, and now I was calling in my debts. They had stolen from a child to fund their golden boy's lifestyle, and they had spent the next 2 decades gaslighting that child into believing she was the burden. The legal notice was merely the opening move in a much larger professional escalation. I wanted them to feel the precise, suffocating weight of legal accountability. They had always operated under the arrogant assumption that they were untouchable, protected by their social status and my enduring silence. But silence is not weakness. Sometimes It is just the time it takes to build a watertight case. The situation escalated much faster than I could have ever anticipated. 3 days after the initial legal notice was served, Marcus called me into his office for an emergency meeting. He didn't offer a polite greeting or small talk when I walked in. He simply turned his large desktop monitor toward me, his expression grave. We initiated a deep background check on your parents' financial history to properly calculate the compound interest on the trust, Marcus explained, his tone deadly serious. In the process, we pulled your complete credit history to ensure there were no other shared liabilities or hidden accounts. He handed me a thick stack of printed papers. They were loan documents, high-value personal loans, equipment financing agreements, and a massive revolving line of credit, all taken out over the past 5 years. The total principal exceeded $250,000. And at the bottom of every single document, meticulously copied but distinctly false, was my signature. I stared at the pages, perfectly still. I had never signed these papers. I traced the blue ink on the copies. The forgery was clumsy but effective enough to pass basic banking scrutiny. Richard had used my pristine credit score, built from years of disciplined financial management and steady engineering income, to secure loans that financed Jacob's luxury lifestyle. My father had literally stolen my identity to subsidize my brother's extravagant vacations, his premium golf club memberships, and the massive down payment on his downtown condominium. This discovery shifted the conflict entirely. It was no longer a bitter family drama over a childhood trust fund. It was a massive, multi-count criminal fraud. This was a legal nightmare that carried severe federal penalties and mandatory minimum sentencing. The daughter they had mocked as a trash hauler now held the keys to their prison cell. I looked at the forged documents, feeling a profound, chilling sense of detachment. I rubbed my eyes, attempting to summon even a fraction of regret or sorrow for what would happen to them, but there was only cold clarity. I didn't feel betrayed, because betrayal requires a foundation of trust, and I had stopped trusting them long ago. What are our options? I asked Marcus, my voice perfectly level. I can file a police report right now, Marcus said, tapping his pen against the desk. It is felony identity theft and wire fraud. They will undoubtedly face prison time. Draft the police report, I instructed, but do not file it yet. Have it ready, completely finalized, signed, and printed. Bring it to me. I took the copies of the forged documents and placed them carefully into my briefcase. My parents had spent my entire life building a grand social facade, an illusion of elite superiority and untouchable wealth. Now, I possessed the exact tools required to demolish it completely. They had underestimated me at every turn, assuming I would simply absorb their abuse forever. The second dinner took place on a Friday night at the Grand Mariner, the most exclusive and expensive seafood restaurant in the city. Richard and Susan had demanded the meeting, likely believing they could intimidate me into dropping the legal threats in a highly public setting where I would be afraid to cause a scene. Jacob sat beside them, looking slightly nervous but maintaining his usual arrogant posture. I arrived exactly on time, taking my seat across from them with clinical precision. My father leaned forward immediately, his voice a low, threatening rumble designed to project authority. You are going to stop this nonsense right now, Tessa. You are going to drop this ridiculous demand for the $2,800, or you will be cut out of this family entirely. We will not tolerate this disrespect. You are embarrassing us, Susan added, her face pinched with anger and entitlement. Jacob's wedding is in 3 months. We will not let you ruin this with your petty jealousy. Before I could formulate a response, a shadow fell over our table. Dr. Alana Sorrento stood there, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, her expression colder than ice. She did not look at me. Her gaze was fixed directly on Richard and Susan. I received a very interesting file from Tessa's attorney today, Dr. Sorrento said, her voice carrying the crisp, undeniable authority of a chief surgeon. A file detailing multiple counts of felony fraud. Forging your daughter's signature to secure $250,000 in loans to fund Jacob's lifestyle. Jacob's face drained of all color instantly. He stared at his parents, completely panicked, his mouth opening and closing without sound. "Alana, please, there is a terrible misunderstanding," Richard stammered, the grand facade of the powerful patriarch crumbling in a fraction of a second. "The wedding is cancelled," Dr. Sorrento said flatly, ignoring his plea. "My daughter will not be marrying into a family of felons. If you ever contact her again, I will personally ensure this police report is handed directly to the district attorney." She turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor, leaving absolute devastation in her wake. My parents' carefully curated social facade was shattered beyond repair. Their golden son had just lost his elite marriage, and their darkest financial secrets were exposed. Susan began to hyperventilate, clutching her pearl necklace. "Tessa, what have you done? You destroyed your brother's life." "I didn't forge the signatures, Susan," I said calmly. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a single, crisp, legal document. I slid it across the mahogany table toward my mother. "What is this?" she whispered, her hands shaking violently as she looked at the paper. "It is a 30-day eviction notice," I replied, my voice steady and transactional. "When you defaulted on the secondary mortgage on the family estate last year, the bank sold the debt. It was purchased by a private holding company. I own that holding company. I legally purchased the house. And you have 30 days to vacate my property." Richard stared at the eviction notice, his breathing shallow and rapid. They were utterly broken, stripped of their money, their status, and their home. I stood up from the table, smoothing my jacket. I looked at the people who had treated me like a warning sign for 3 decades. There was no anger left, only a clean, quiet finality. "Goodbye, Mum." In the weeks that followed that final dinner, I experienced what I can only describe as the clean quiet after a Category 5 hurricane. The toxic debris of my old life had been entirely swept away, leaving behind a clear, unobstructed horizon. I meticulously packed up my apartment, finalized the sale of the foreclosed family estate, and relocated my life and my engineering firm to Savannah, Georgia. My parents and Jacob faded into the background of my existence. Without the estate and their fraudulent credit lines, they were forced to downsize drastically. The criminal charges hung over Richard's head, keeping them entirely focused on their own survival rather than harassing me. I didn't care to follow the details of their downfall. I had closed their accounts, and I had permanently closed that chapter of my life. In Savannah, the air was warm, and the pace of life finally allowed me to breathe. I took a substantial portion of the profits from the sale of my former family's estate and launched a charitable foundation. It was specifically designed to provide vocational training, engineering scholarships, and financial literacy programs for young women navigating difficult family dynamics. This brings me to a concept I like to call the justice of the planter. True justice is not merely about salting the earth of those who wronged you. It is about taking the resources they hoarded and using them to plant a forest. When you elevate revenge to restoration, you strip the antagonists of their power permanently. My parents had spent their lives tearing me down to build up a fragile illusion of superiority. I took the financial remnants of their illusion and used it to build a concrete reality for women who needed a firm foundation to stand on. I didn't just survive their cruelty. I recycled it into something powerful and generative. That is the ultimate victory. The trash hauler didn't just clean up the mess. She built an empire from the salvage. I've come to realize that walking away from toxic family members is not an act of betrayal. It is an act of profound self-preservation. For years, I carried the crushing weight of their expectations, falsely believing that if I could just carry enough of their burdens, I would finally earn my place at their table. I poured my energy into a deficit, hoping for love that was never going to come. The grief of accepting that your parents will never be the people you need them to be is immense. It is a quiet, mourning process that you have to navigate alone. But forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free from the endless cycle of trying to prove your worth. Letting go of the hope for their approval was the hardest, most necessary thing I have ever done. I didn't need them to apologize or understand my choices. I found true peace not in a forced reconciliation, but in the quiet dignity of my own hard-won independence. I forgave myself for taking so long to see my own worth, and in doing so, I finally found my home. I built a life filled with genuine relationships, surrounded by people who value my presence, not just my financial utility. The storm is over, and the structure I built in its wake is unshakable. True strength isn't about how hard you can hit back, but how well you can build your own future. If this story spoke to you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. See you in the next story.